Arizona Territory. 1879, the sun was barely up when the cowboy found the blood. Yates Callahan pulled his horse to a halt beside the rocks, his eyes narrowing at the dark trail that cut through the pale desert dust. A soft wind stirred the dry grass, carrying a faint coppery tang. He stepped down from the saddle, boots crunching as he followed the drops, each one spaced like heartbeats. "Easy, boy," he murmured to his horse before unstrapping his rifle. He headed up the incline, slow and watchful, every sense sharpened. That was when he heard a weak breath, sharp and fast, behind a mesquite bush. He circled wide and came around, rifle raised. She lay curled in the dirt, dress torn, left shoulder bound tight in a blood-soaked bandage. Her skin was pale beneath the dust, lips cracked, eyes wide but unfocused. Her right hand gripped the bandage like it was the only thing holding her together. "Do not take it off," she said, her voice hoarse but urgent. "Please, do not take off the bandage." Yates lowered the rifle slowly. "All right," he said gently. "I will not," she blinked, her gaze clearing just a little. "You are not with them?" "No, ma'am," he said, crouching to her level. "Name's Yates Callahan. I was headed to Bisbee, found your trail." She sagged back, her breath shuddering. "They left me, thought I would bleed out." "Took the horses." "Who did?" he asked, already pulling his canteen and offering it. She drank, then winced. "3 men. Said they would trade escort for coin. I had none, just wanted to get across the flats with my girls." "You have children?" Yates asked, still watching her wound. She nodded weakly. "2 daughters, Clara and Ceci, they took them." Yates' jaw clenched. "Where?" "They rode northwest. I think toward the old mining camp near Black Ridge." Yates looked at the sun climbing behind them. That camp was a 4-hour ride if you pushed it. He looked back at her. She was barely conscious. "You got a name, Zadie," she whispered. "Zadie Orlin." "I will get them back, Zadie," Yates said, "but I need to move you. I cannot leave you here." "No, the bandage." "Then I will not touch it," he promised. Yates carried her carefully to his horse, settling her across the saddle with her good arm over his shoulder. She barely stirred. He rode fast but careful, angling east toward a shaded arroyo he remembered from a cattle drive 2 years back. There was a spring there and some cover. He could keep her safe while he rode after the girls. By the time he got the fire going and laid her on his bedroll, she was burning up. He sat beside her through the heat of the day, dampening her forehead with water and murmuring soft things he barely thought about. That night, she woke again. "I did not want to go with them," she said, "but I had no coin. No one would help a widow with 2 girls and no name." "You have a name," Yates said. "Zadie Orlin, that is enough." Her lips curved faintly. "You are kind." "I am angry," he said quietly, "at what they did. But right now, I just want to keep you alive." She reached for his hand with her uninjured one, and he let her take it. Her fingers were small and cold. "You should not have stopped," she whispered. "Most would have ridden on." "I am not most." That night, Yates did not sleep much. At dawn, he left her a rifle, tucked her beneath the blanket, and whispered, "I will bring them back, Zadie. I swear it." He rode hard. Dust rose behind him like smoke as he tracked the men northwest. He found their trail by mid-morning, 3 horses, 2 with lighter loads, 1 dragging. Children. He caught up by late afternoon, just as the sun began to tip west. The old mining camp was mostly abandoned rusted rails, collapsed shacks, and the stink of bat guano. He tied his horse and moved in quiet. He saw them near the main shaft. 1 man stood guard while the other 2 drank from a jug. The girls were tied near a broken wagon, faces pale, dresses filthy. Clara looked around 9 and Ceci maybe 6. 1 was crying. Yates took a breath, then stepped out with his rifle raised. "Get away from them." The men spun, eyes wide. 1 reached for his revolver, but Yates fired first. The shot rang out sharp and final. 1 man dropped. The second ran. The third surrendered, hands shaking, mouth running with excuses. Yates tied him to a post and freed the girls. "Your mama is safe," he said. "She is waiting." "Come on." Clara looked up at him, eyes huge. "Is she hurt?" "She is strong," Yates said. "Just like you two." They rode double on his horse, slow and careful now. When they reached the arroyo, the girls cried out and leapt from the saddle. Zadie reached for them with a broken sob, folding them into her arms. Yates stood back, chest tight, watching the three of them cling to each other like they were made from the same soul. Later, after the fire was lit and the girls had fallen asleep curled up together, Zadie sat beside him. Her face was pale, but her eyes were steady. "You brought them back," she said. "I said I would. You had no reason to. You do not even know me." "I do now," he said simply. She studied him for a long while, then she reached up and touched her bandage. "It is worse than I let on," she said softly. "I think the bleeding started again." "Then let me look," he said. She hesitated, then nodded. He peeled it back slowly, careful not to tear the skin. When he saw what lay beneath, he froze. A deep, jagged wound cut from her shoulder to her collarbone, torn and clumsily stitched, now red and angry with infection. But what undid him was not the wound. It was the way she had tried to stitch it herself, one-handed with shaking fingers. The thread was uneven, the pain obvious in every pull, his eyes filled with tears. "You did this alone," he said, voice rough. "I had to," she whispered. He reached for her hand again, held it tight. "You do not any more." The wind shifted at dusk, carrying the scent of creosote and distant rain. Yates sat cross-legged near the fire, slicing strips of rabbit meat thin, and laying them across a flat rock to smoke. Zadie rested beside the girls beneath the canvas sheet he'd rigged low between two junipers. Her wound had quieted some. He'd cleaned it with boiled water and carbolic acid, then wrapped it in clean muslin he cut from his spare shirt. She hadn't cried out once, even when his hands trembled, and the infection seeped dark along the edge of the stitches. Now her eyes were open, watching the firelight flicker across his face. "You're a quiet man, Mr. Callahan," she said. "Most things worth saying don't need to be said loud." She gave a slow nod. "Back in Kansas, my husband used to say things like that. He was a blacksmith." Liked the sound of the forge more than his own voice. Yates rubbed his thumb along the worn handle of his knife. "He died during the war." "No," she said, voice steady. "Caught in a flood 2 years after. We were trying to get across the Cottonwood River. Wagon didn't make it." He looked up, the fire crackling between them. "That why you came west?" There was nothing left there but mud and memory. "I thought maybe if I kept moving, the land might forget me." She glanced toward the girls. "I didn't count on how much the world wants to take when you've got nothing." Yates stood and walked over to the horses. He checked the cinches, ran a hand down the bay's flank. The animals were tired but sound. "You planning to stay near Bisbee?" he asked, not turning. "My sister's buried in a churchyard just east of town. She died of fever the year before last. I was hoping to find the land she claimed. Thought maybe I could start something for the girls there. You know where it is? Only that it's near a stand of cottonwoods and the soil's red clay. She wrote me a letter before she passed. Said she'd marked the corner with stones shaped like a horseshoe." Yates stepped back into the firelight, his face unreadable. "I know the place. Rode past it during roundup last fall. Land still empty." Zadie sighed and reached to tuck a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "I don't expect anyone to make room for us, but I'd like to try." He sat beside her slowly, resting his forearms across his knees. "You've got more grit than most men I've known." She glanced at him. "That's something you admire." "I think it's something I need," he said, eyes still on the fire. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The flames popped softly and the girls shifted in their sleep. When he finally looked at her again, her head was turned toward the stars, one hand resting just above the bandage. "I never told you something," she said. "What's that?" "When I first saw you before you spoke, I thought you were death." I was ready for him. Yates leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "And now," she turned to meet his eyes, "now I think maybe death just wears a different face than I thought." He didn't answer, just reached out, slow and deliberate, and took her hand in his. Her fingers curled into his palm, warm despite the cool night air. "You said you were angry," she murmured. "I still am." "Why?" He worked his jaw for a moment, eyes on where their hands met. "Because this world breaks good people for no reason. Because you had to stitch your own shoulder alone in the dirt." Zadie's voice dropped. "But you found me." His grip tightened slightly. "I did." She leaned against his shoulder, careful of her side. The fire cast long shadows behind them, and the moon began to rise, quiet and full. "I don't want to be alone again," she whispered. "You don't have to be," he said. "Not anymore." They sat that way until the fire burned low, the desert holding its breath around them. Yates didn't move when she fell asleep against him. He just watched the dying embers and held her hand like it was something sacred. By the time they reached the edge of Bisbee, the early light was spilling down through the hills, catching on the tin roofs scattered along Brewery Gulch. Yates led the mare with the girls riding drowsy across its back. Zadie bundled behind him, her breath faint against his spine. Her fever had steadied some through the night, but he didn't like the way her voice had gone thinner, or how her hand trembled when she tried to hold the reins. They stopped at the edge of a low adobe house set off from the road. A woman in a wide apron stepped out before Yates had even dismounted, squinting into the morning. "I was told you'd be by," she said. "I wired ahead from Sulphur Junction," he answered. "Said we'd need a quiet place for a spell." The woman glanced at Zadie, then at the girls who had begun to stir. "Get her inside. I've got willowbark tea steeped and a cot by the stove." Yates carried her in. She didn't speak, but her fingers curled faintly in his shirt as he crossed the threshold. The house smelled of lye soap and flour, and the warmth from the stove hit like summer air. He set her down gently, and the woman, Mrs. Talmadge, a widow who'd once run the boarding house, began to unlace the girls' boots and settle them on a pallet with warm milk and a folded quilt. "She'll rest now," she said, rinsing a rag in warm water. "But she needs more than rest." Yates nodded. "I'll get it." He left them there and walked down to the mercantile. The shopkeep gave him a sharp look but filled his list without comment. Clean cloth, powdered alum, a small jar of honey, and a packet of dried echinacea root. It cost more than he'd planned, but he paid it without counting. When he returned, Zadie was asleep, her hair damp against her brow. Mrs. Talmadge was kneeling beside the cot, dabbing her shoulder with the fresh cloth. "She told me not to take off the bandage," Yates said quietly. The older woman didn't answer right away. She lifted the edge of the cloth, checked the swelling, then replaced it with a light touch. "She said the same to me," she said, like it was the one thing she could still control. Yates watched the rise and fall of Zadie's chest. "She's got a strong will. That's why she's still breathing." Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the wooden shutters. By late afternoon, a fine dust settled along the windowsills, and the girls had fallen asleep again in the corner, curled together like bramble kittens. Yates sat near the stove, carving the edge of a broken broom handle into something smoother, more useful. His hands needed something to do. Zadie stirred as the sun dropped behind the hills. Her eyes opened slowly, and when they landed on him, they stayed. "You came back," she said. "I didn't leave long. I thought it might have been a dream, all of it." He set the carved stick aside. "No dream." She watched him a moment longer, then tried to push herself upright. Her jaw tightened, but she didn't cry out. "Don't," he said. "You'll tear it again." "I need to move. I feel like I've melted into the bed." He stood and crossed to her. "Lean on me." She did, her shoulder pressing into his side, her breath close. He helped her sit up, one hand steady at her back. "I used to think I could do anything if I just kept moving forward," she said. "But I didn't figure on how far gone I was until you showed up." He looked down at her. "You weren't gone, you were stranded." She turned her head slightly, enough to see his face. "And you came anyway," he nodded once. After a long silence, she said, "I never believed in being rescued." "I didn't come to save you," he said. "I came because I couldn't ride past." She was quiet again, then asked, "What will you do now?" "I've got a lease on a stretch of land west of town. It's rough, but there's water, and I've been meaning to fence it." She studied him. "You live alone." "I do." "Would you want to keep it that way?" His breath stilled. "No," she looked down at her lap, fingers touching the edge of the fresh bandage. "I've got 2 daughters who never learned to be still. They'll chase rabbits and burn your biscuits." "I burn my own just fine." She smiled, small and tired but real. "I'm not asking for kindness. I'm not offering it," he said. "Not only that," her eyes lifted. "Then what are you offering?" He held her gaze. "A place. A name if you want it. A man who won't run." Her throat moved once as she swallowed. "And if I said yes, I'd start fixing the fence tomorrow." She exhaled slowly, then leaned her head against his shoulder. "I never thought I'd feel safe again," she said. "You are now." Outside, the wind quieted. Inside, the warmth held. And in that small adobe room, without ceremony or speeches, something new settled between them, solid as earth, quiet as dusk, and just as certain. The days that followed passed quiet and full. Zadie rested, waking longer each time, sipping broth left by Mrs. Talmadge, her voice gaining steadiness as the fever dulled. The girls spent their mornings outside the small adobe, dragging sticks through the grit, building forts out of kindling and stacking stones like they were homesteads. Yates fixed the hinge that hung crooked over the back door, then mended a mule harness for the widow in exchange for flour and salt pork. He didn't speak much unless spoken to, but his presence filled the corners of the house like cedar smoke, faint but constant. One evening, just after the sun had slipped past the ridge, Zadie stepped out with a blanket across her shoulders and found Yates splitting mesquite by the fence. "Should you be on your feet?" he asked, pausing mid-swing. "I need to learn what pain means when it's not survival," she said. "Feels different when it's not chasing you." He set the axe down and leaned against the post. "You look stronger. I feel like a person again." She moved carefully to the low bench near the well. "Didn't think I'd come back to myself." He joined her, hands still dusty. "You knew where to look." She gave a small breath that might have been a laugh. "You think I meant to find myself here? Half dead in a stranger's bed, girls curled up beside me like pups in a den." "No," he said, "but I think you meant to survive, and you did." She looked down at her hands. The skin along her knuckles had begun to pink again, the raw cracks healing over. "You ever lose something that made you question the ground under your boots?" she asked, not looking up. "Once," he said. "A brother, younger than me by 2 years, died when his horse fell in the Gila Wash. I was the one who told him to cross." She didn't speak, but her shoulder pressed slightly closer against his. "I don't talk about him," he said. "Not because I want to forget, just sometimes remembering makes the rest of the day harder." "I understand that." He glanced at her. "Your husband, was he kind to you?" He was. Not soft, but steady. He never raised his voice, never once blamed me when we lost the baby between Clara and Ceci. Yates nodded slowly. "That kind of man doesn't vanish from a woman's bones." "No," she said. "But neither does the way you carried me through the desert." He looked down at his hands. I didn't think about anything but finding you water. That's what I mean." The wind moved through the dry grass, whispering low along the fence line. In the distance, a coyote called once, then went silent. "I don't want to go back to being someone who expects nothing," she said, "even if it's safer." "You won't have to," he said, voice low. She turned to him fully then, her eyes darker in the dusk light. "I'm not sure how to begin again without walking backward." "You don't have to begin again," he said. "You just have to keep going from here." He stood then and offered her a hand, not rushed, not expectant, just open. She looked at it for a moment, then took it and let him help her to her feet. Inside, the girls were already asleep. Mrs. Talmadge had gone to her own room, the lamp turned low. Zadie lay down beside her daughters, then reached out and touched Yates's wrist before he stepped back. "I want this," she said. "Not out of debt, not to be saved, I just want you." His voice was quiet. "Then you've got me." She pulled the blanket higher around her girls, then reached out for his hand again. He knelt beside her, and she rested her forehead against his. Nothing more passed between them that night, no rush, no claim. Just the steady breath of two people who had lived through fire and found each other on the other side. In the morning, he saddled the gray and rode west. The land near the cottonwoods waited, red clay and flat stone. He spent 2 days there, marking boundaries, clearing brush, and fixing the old fence line with new cedar posts. When he returned to town, he brought back a sack of seed, a coil of wire, and a question in his pocket. He stepped into the adobe kitchen where Zadie was kneading bread with her sleeves rolled. She looked up, flour on her cheek. "You've been gone," she said. "I had to see if it'd hold." "What?" "The land. The idea." She wiped her hands on her apron. "And did it?" He reached into his coat and placed a small carved box on the table. Inside was a ring, nothing grand, just thin silver with a turquoise stone set flush into the band. "I want you and the girls with me, not just for now." Zadie touched the box, then looked at him. "We've seen each other at our worst. That's how I know it'll last." She closed the lid gently. "Then yes." He let out a breath like he hadn't known he'd been holding it. Outside, the town stirred slowly to life. But inside that small adobe, a new life had already begun, quiet, certain, and built not on rescue, but on something stronger than survival: choice. The first morning on the land came with a pale gold sky and the smell of iron-rich soil. Yates rose before the sun cleared the ridge, fed the horses, and walked the fence line, checking the posts he'd set earlier that week. With each step, he felt the ground taking their weight a little more, like the land had begun to know them. Zadie came out with a shawl around her shoulders and a tin cup of coffee in each hand. She didn't say anything, just passed him one and stood beside him, watching the light bloom across the hills. Her hair was still damp from the basin, tucked behind her ears, and her left arm rested easy now, the bone mended beneath the skin. "The girls are up?" he asked, sipping the coffee. "They're trying to name the hens. Clara thinks they should all be called Queenie." "Same name for all of them. It's a system," she said with a small shrug. "Not a good one." He chuckled low, then reached for her hand. "I was thinking we could start on the garden bed this afternoon. I have seed for squash and beans. Maybe cucumber. We'll need a scarecrow," she said. "Ceci's already worried the birds'll eat everything before it sprouts. She can help me build it. I've got an old hat we can use." Zadie looked out across the land, where the cottonwoods rustled in the breeze and a pair of hawks circled overhead. "I never thought we'd belong anywhere again," she said. "You do here," he answered. Inside the cabin, they'd arranged the space with care. A cot for the girls near the hearth, a proper bed in the corner with a quilt Zadie had finished sewing last week. The table bore the marks of use: a shallow notch where Clara had dropped a ladle, another where a nail had been driven in too deep. The walls were still bare, but he'd begun carving a length of mesquite to hang over the door, something to shape with their initials and the date they first arrived. By late morning, the girls were outside gathering stones for the path Zadie wanted to lay between the cabin and the well. She knelt beside the garden bed, pressing her thumb into the soil, testing the softness beneath. Yates watched her work, the sun warm across her back. The sleeve of her dress rolled past the scar that had once nearly undone her. "Don't overdo it," he said as he walked over. "I'm not made of glass," she replied, brushing her hands clean on her skirt. "Never said you were, just don't want you sore by sundown." She stood and stretched, her fingers brushing his jaw before falling to her side. "I want to put roots down. That means planting something." He nodded. "You already have. Right here." That night they ate cornbread and beans on the porch while the girls chased fireflies. Zadie rested her head against Yates's shoulder, her fingers laced with his. The air smelled of mesquite ash and earth. The sky was wide and dark, hanging low with stars. "I've been thinking," she said, "about the name for the land, for us." He turned to face her, the lamplight catching her eyes. "What do you want it to be?" "I want your name," she said. "If you'll have me." He didn't speak at first. Just leaned forward and kissed her, slow and certain, like a promise spoken through breath. "I already do." They were married a week later. Beneath the cottonwoods her sister once walked between. Mrs. Talmadge came out from town to stand as witness. The girls wore sprigs of sage in their hair and scattered wildflowers along the trail leading to the clearing. Yates carved 2 rings from silver coins, one for Zadie, one for Clara to hold until Ceci was old enough to wear it. The vows were simple. No preacher, no scripture. Just hands held and words spoken clear. "I'll walk beside you. I'll work beside you. I'll love you through all the seasons we're given." And then it was done. That night, after the girls were asleep and the fire burned low, Zadie stepped out into the yard, bare feet pressing into the soft dust. Yates followed, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders. "You cold?" he asked. "No, just thinking how far we've come. You miss Kansas. I miss who I was before the losing started. But I like who I am now, too." He kissed her temple, then drew her close. They stood like that a long time, the sounds of the night all around them, crickets, the low hoot of an owl, the steady breath of the land beneath their feet. The garden took root that spring. The hens laid steady. Clara learned to read by lamplight, and Ceci made up songs about the wind. Yates built a second room off the cabin, and Zadie stitched curtains from old flour sacks. They did not live with ease, but they lived with certainty, with hands held through storms and shoulders leaned on during lean harvests. There were days when the past caught in their throats, when silence hung heavy. But there was always something to build, something to mend, something to grow. And in that work, they found peace. They grew old holding the same rhythm, his hand brushing hers when he passed her in the kitchen, her voice humming low while she washed the bowls. Love didn't arrive with thunder. It came like rain across dry earth, slow, steady, and enough to make things bloom.